Why does software at work suck? It's a recurring question I ask on Make Sense because it affects so many of us daily. Big, bloated enterprise software that doesn't make our workdays any easier. And with every executive talking about AI in the enterprise, blah, 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 is it really going to make work better? Or are we going to see more IT nightmares? Today, we're making sense of big companies' initiatives to adopt AI. And if it's happening, whether we like it or not, how can we all raise the bar as problem solvers at work? To help us simplify this mess, let me introduce you to today's guest, Joe Meersman. Joe is a partner at The Collective and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at Austin, where he teaches visual communication at the School of Design and Creative Technologies. He brings over 25 years of user experience and creative design expertise and has worked at some big brands like Motorola, Razorfish, and IBM. I cannot wait for this conversation. But first, welcome to this week's episode of Make Sense, a video podcast that simplifies complex issues at the intersection of tech and people. There are many. Whether you're totally hyped on AI and ready for the robot takeover, or you want to crawl into a cave after deleting all of your social media accounts, I'm here with my guests to help make sense of what's going on so you can all design yourselves into the future. My name is Lindsay Tabus, the Lady Engineer. I am a pragmatic futurist and human-first technologist, serial entrepreneur, and innovation consultant. If you're new here, subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So let's make sense of big companies' pursuit of AI and how we might smooth out the inevitable wrinkles that come with it. Joe, how are you?
I'm doing great. I think I'm somewhere in between delete all my stuff and go to the cave and welcoming the robot overlords.
Yeah.
Which for me is pretty normal. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an even keeled, moderate person. I rarely swing towards the extremes, so I totally get that. And I think that that's going to make it great for you. Great to have you on this show. You and I met through Ronnie Batista, who was a guest on the show in December. For listeners, Ronnie's episode was titled Future of Enterprise Systems and Its Role in the Employee Experience. If you like this episode with Joe, you will also like this episode with Ronnie. So make sure you listen to this one and then go back and listen to that one. So let's start with our first segment, Crystal Ball. What does the future hold? This is where I call out interesting predictions for this year, and the experts, my guests, tell us their hot take. I'm going to fire off some predictions, and Joe, I want you to say, yes, I want that to happen, or yes, that is happening, or no, please, no, I don't want that to happen. Okay. Today, I'm pitching you 3 predictions I actually made for this year. It's futile to think we know the future, but I thought I'd give it a try. I love being right, but you can tell me if you think I'm wrong. Okay.
No
Ready?
problem.
Cool. Many generative AI companies, mostly startups, will fold. So after a huge hype year in 2023, we enter a period of disappointment. Competition, unpolished results, and low returns from enterprise customers will bring us back to reality.
Love it. Pretty strong provocation to get us started here. So, you're it sounds like in your crystal ball, what you're reading is that we're going to see some companies that have been in the AI space either go through a round of merger, potentially get acquired, or fold.
Yeah.
I'd like to tell you that there's a confluence of factors that are going to go into that, not the least of which is going to be microeconomic, right? And to me, that's going to be a function of whether or not their product market fit was really strong,
Mm-hmm.
right? So from an investor perspective, what people are going to look at as to whether or not they're going to actively to continue to, like feed the beast and take their capital and plow it into this investment is whether or not, there's a viable, need for people, and or whether or not the company is profitable. And, I think some of that is out of our sphere of influence and control. I do think right now that the way capital is being deployed in like a traditional sense is that it's heavy on AI as opposed to, like the broader enterprise software landscape. I think tech is cooled to one degree or another, and or people that have been investing for years in technology with like a 0% interest rate are starting to want to see growth and or profitability regardless of whether or not it's rule of 40. Now, when I think about like the overall state of the economy, that's anybody's best guess. And, with an upcoming election, I think that there are certain things that are outside of our sphere of influence, but net, I'm going to agree with you there in that I think that we need to see a little bit of a shakeout. And we've got competition in specifically in the AI space that seems to be a little asymmetrical. And at the end of the day, the cost of compute is really high.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned something. I want to make sure everyone understands it. You said the rule of 40. What is that?
Yeah, it's a rule tied to company growth, and I mean, to me, it's been kind of a very aggressive target, but it mostly comes from the perspective of an investor as to like how they want to maximize or like optimize their return. And, if a company's growing at a certain rule of 40 aggressive clip, you're going to want to maintain your investment and potentially increase it. And
Mm.
it's more or less like a operational and financial target from an investment standpoint. And, I believe it's more often referenced by those at like the C-suite and their respective board members as to like trying to hit that aggressive target.
Yeah, I actually had to just quickly Google search it myself, even though I have been evaluating pre-seed seed startups for 7.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
That term has never really come up. And what it is that the combined growth rate of both revenue and profit margin should be 40%. That's basically what it said. Cool.
And it's very aggressive,
Yeah,
right? and
very aggressive.
and just as like NPS shouldn't be the only measure of customer satisfaction, I don't really agree that rule of 40 should be the only measure of whether or not a company has long-term potential or even short-term potential for that matter. But it's kind of a easy thing for people to latch on to and use as I wouldn't say a checklist item or a stick, but it's probably, an easy thing for someone to ask if they don't have a lot of time and they're trying to
Yeah.
size up potential investment.
Similar to like when we look at the weather, yes, there's a temperature, but there's also humidity and wind and other things to factor into. Let's go to our next prediction. Politicians will blame AI for election results. So, only a month into 2024, there was a fake Biden robocalls, and that showed us the damage of AI deepfakes.
Mhm.
As Trump runs for re-election. There's also an election in the UK, and the Israel-Hamas misinformation war wages on. We need to start stocking our ammo to get prepared for this.
Um, I I'm gonna agree with you there once again in that I think in this case AI is both a known and unknown factor, right? So if I think about it through the lens of whether or not it gives somebody an easy out or like a boogeyman or woman to go blame, of course it's going to come up, right? And part of that is because we don't know like the thresholds and the kind of the potential that the technology has. I'll also say that, like, I think it was last week or the week before, there were photos that were AI generated or otherwise doctored of like Trump sitting with African Americans and or like other minorities.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I took one look at it and said, "Oh, that's fake,"
Yeah.
right? And I think that it does require a trained eye to spot some instances. But what I think AI can do in a really awful way is provide confirmation bias.
Right.
You know, so it's going to be a factor. There are super smart people that are thinking about it, and when it comes to the nature of like election interference writ large, that's not going to be new. It's just a question of how pervasively we can claim and or prove or disprove that it's been a factor.
Yeah. Cool. I would admit that I think this is an easy one to agree with because given, especially in the US, with accusations of election fraud and how far those accusations went, most likely without AI interference, it's going to be easy to find. There's scapegoats everywhere and people ready to point to them. So
Yeah, like the technology makes it an easy target.
yeah,
You know.
100%.
Yeah.
So, last prediction. One major copyright case against AI will change its trajectory. So, authors versus OpenAI and Google, Getty versus Stability AI, developers versus GitHub.
Mhm.
Courts will find at least one guilty, and that will cause chaos, particularly for enterprise adoption.
Do you mind just like crisping up or helping me to understand like what the yes no is? Sorry.
That there will be at least one major copyright case
Oh,
against AI that will be settled this year,
I
and it will change the technology's trajectory.
I think that they'll. Thank you. I appreciate that. Because I respect the fact that it's a compound question,
Yeah.
right? Because it has to be. So when it comes to will there be a case that's settled? Absolutely. I think there'll be several. I don't know that it'll be settled in court, right? I think there'll likely be a bunch that are quietly settled out of court. I think the number that'll go to trial are going to be few and far between because it's a complex issue, and the average juror is probably not going to grok the complexities of the technology very easily, even after it's being explained or
Hmm.
after it's been explained. Do I think it'll slow the trajectory of the technology? Not in the slightest,
Mm.
right? Like, I think that technology will always outpace regulation, and it that's been the case since the dawn of technology.
Right.
You can tell somebody not to do something, and you can give them stern warnings. But it really, to me, all regulation comes down to the ability for it to be policed, and at the current scale that it's operating in, I think the free market is its own worst enemy here,
Hmm.
and nobody's going to put the air brakes on or the engine brakes on for that matter in order to comply with regulation. I think it's going to be a case of you're only guilty if you're caught.
So, one of the reasons I thought that a copyright case might slow down specifically enterprise adoption
Mm-hmm.
is that if we think about our Fortune 50, Fortune 500 companies,
Mm-hmm.
if they can't certify that the imagery they're using doesn't infringe on a copyright, if they're using AI generated images, then they may internally block their employees from using those tools since they can't. Is that something you think would happen, or you think same goes for inside, employees will go rogue and use whatever they want?
I think employees are always going to go rogue, right? Because especially when we have the ability to work from home and or to turn the VPN off, there's the ability to leverage different tooling. I
Mm-hmm.
think I also think that there's what we do during 9 to 5 is not necessarily the exclusive domain of what we're getting paid to do. I also think that a company would I don't think a company is going to take any measures that are active. They'll take more kind of I would say they're not going to take action. I think if anything, they'll take the route of inaction and they'll publish governance and policies internally. But again, they won't go into policing them until somebody gets sued. I
Mm-hmm.
think your example around image generation is valid. But what would really be the determining factor is what that model has been trained on and whether or not someone can prove what the model's been trained on.
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking like several $100,000, if not $1 million of lawsuits there, and a good amount of time that has to play out.
Okay, cool. All right, I like it. Thank you for weighing in on those.
Mm-hmm.
So, before we go into the second segment, I do want to make a quick announcement. If you are new to Make Sense, I prepared a list of the top 10 clips from the first 30 episodes. This episode is actually number 49. So, dive into the most insightful clips without having to watch full episodes by visiting lindsayt.com/MS top 10, lindsayt.com/ms top 10. It'll also be in the show notes. So, going into our second segment, Joe, deep dive. In this segment, we get into a specific technology's implications for everyday people. We've already been there from the first segment with AI. So, we're talking to non-technical business consultants, maybe their marketing or advertising. If we can explain it to them, then our nerdy enterprise software users, data scientists, and the like will get it too, right? So, Make Sense listeners want to have an informed opinion on AI adoption without having to listen to the Uber geeks talk about the intricacies of large language models. And at the same time, we're entering what Gartner calls the Trough of Disillusionment. After 2023, there was a peak of inflated expectations, and we're going back to life, back to reality. What can AI really do for us right now? So, let's talk about all the pitfalls and challenges listeners should consider when it comes to enterprise adoption of AI. First,
Sure.
what do you general like topic or response? I mean, general response to the things I just said. Do you agree that there's a trough of disillusionment, or do you think people are still flying high off the fumes of potential?
I it's a great jumping off point in that Forrester and Gartner not only create the hype that drives the cycle and results in the trough of disillusionment, but they're also branding the trough of disillusionment. I mean, I got started in all things AI in the early days of Watson at IBM in the quote unquote productization of what was really like research code that was meant to, sift through and sort through like very specific corpus in order to answer direct questions. And I lived that first hype cycle back then,
Mhm.
right?
When was that?
And what's that?
When was that? Like about when?
Oh, it probably started to kick up like late 2013, 2014, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And, if we look at the fact that that was 10 years ago, what we saw were very narrow applications of AI as a technology to drive business outcomes. And at that point in time, you needed a lot more like hands-on training slash people didn't really understand the nature of the technology, which has of course evolved since that period of time. I think we are going to see a dip in terms of the public opinion around AI because the more people that got involved in the hype cycle, the more kind of overblown the expectations became. And listen, the technology is incredibly powerful. And when I mentioned earlier that compute is expensive, what I was referring to is like the ability to train up a model as well as, the amount of compute required, for instance, to ask GPT a question versus to run a Google search is like a 5x,
Yeah.
right?
And
So,
and in another episode, I'm going to talk about the electrification problem to power all of this AI.
oh, yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So you're aware of that as a challenge. I think that that there will be there's a trough coming up, and I think harkening back to your first kind of like pop quiz hot item topic, right? We'll see a little bit of a shakeout at the bottom of those AI startups and in that space. I believe that that there's a good amount of education, advocacy, and enablement that needs to take place around AI and the practical applications. And I think that the people that are over indexing on its usage are seeing high performance gains. And I think the people at the low end of the spectrum that are very dubious of it, within the next 3 to 5 years, they will have no choice but to pick up the use of the tool. Otherwise, they won't remain competitive in the marketplace.
Right.
And I think most other people, you've got to take a move like Zapier or like GitHub and really integrate it and make it easy for people to use in order for that trough to kind of soften a little bit.
Right. So for instance, in Evernote or on Quora. On
Mm-hmm.
Quora, you can ask an AI, like there's an AI button to summarize all of the answers that were supplied for a question rather than reading each
Mm-hmm.
one, which I think is pretty cool. And that's an example of embedding it right into a tool and providing additional value. So one of the challenges uh, that I know you've mentioned is AI still needs a human chaperone. What do you mean by that?
Sure. I mean, I'm kind of standing on the shoulders of intellectual giants here, but Moravec's paradox, and for those that aren't familiar with it, Google it up. I think there's a multiple TED talks that reference it. But what that paradox is all about is that like when it comes to AI as well as like all things robotics related, there's low computation required for reasoning, and there's actually like a significant amount of computation required for machines to understand context and to perceive environments that they're not familiar with, right? And at least for me, that helps to represent the fact that there will always need to be a quote unquote human in the loop. And a machine's going to be extremely smart at doing many many things that take us years to train up on,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that doesn't mean that that they're going to be skilled in everything we ask them to do, just as like domain expertise, or I'm sorry, subject matter expertise isn't transferable, which is
Mm-hmm.
a fairly human failing, right? If I'm a high value trial lawyer and I'm in the litigation space, it's easy for me to think that like my problem solving skills and my capabilities as an orator mean that, I can dominate marketing
Mm-hmm.
or, make me a viable candidate for public office.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But that subject matter expertise isn't necessarily like transferable. And I do when people talk about AI resulting in like a new wave of job growth, I think some of that job growth is going to be attributed to those that figure out how to exactly tell the machines what it is we want them to do, provide them guidance,
Mm-hmm.
and evolve like true no code platforms as opposed to something that's kind of quasi no code, low code that
Mm-hmm.
still requires people to understand like the fundamentals of Python as
Yeah.
opposed to like Visual Basic, for
Got
instance.
it. So that sounds also like AI still very much needs humans to frame the problem.
It does in, late Q1 2024.
Yeah.
And I think that what people can either overestimate or underestimate is the fact that the technology, at least as it's implemented in LLMs and or like the development of agents, there's a little bit of magic under the cover. There's a little bit of advanced math that we can infer, but we don't have 100% understanding of.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So when we think about like what powers inference, what allows a machine to understand context, what enables it to kind of perceive its environment and or understand it, there are things that a machine can do that are surprising to the researchers that help to contribute code to allow it to function the way that it does.
Mm. That sounds pretty impressive, but it seems like in practice, like one, you're saying, AI only learns while it's being used and utilized, and then also we still need to like we need to give it some of that context, right? And ask it because it doesn't know what to do otherwise if we don't tell it what to do.
That's the case right now. I wouldn't say that the technology is 100% reactive or proactive at this point in time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, I think there are certain kind of fuzzy edges to the technology that kind of allow the conversations to float from like egghead, propeller head, like code speak
Mm-hmm.
into philosophy real quick.
Right.
And one area of that is awareness. And there's a lot of like fairly public debate right now as to is AI self-aware, is it sentient, is it conscious?
Is it?
And, well, you'll from what I can tell, the overarching consensus is no,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't mean that we know when it will become
Mm.
sentient or conscious or aware.
Mm.
And one of the reasons why it's not black or white is I don't think that there's a objective definition of what it means to be conscious or
Mm-hmm.
sentient or fully self-aware.
Mm.
So if people can't agree on an objective definition, it becomes very hard to ascribe a Boolean yes or no to whether or not the technology is fully aware.
Mm-hmm.
And and this debate has been taking place since like
For a
the
long time, right? Since like the Turing test basically was invented, we've been talking about when can we not tell the difference between
Mhm.
an AI, a computer, and a human, and then the next evolution of that is this, yeah, sentience and
Yeah,
consciousness.
you hit it right on the head. And because it's not a new debate, what I'll close out the topic by saying is that there are essentially two schools of thought. Number one is do nothing, right? Hands off. Let's just keep feeding the machines large data sets and let's see what happens, right? And the risk to that is, of course, we don't know what sort of decisions it's going to make. We don't know what sort of bias it may or may not reflect. We don't know because we can't predict what a normal human being is going to do
Hmm.
when, given a body of knowledge, a bunch of resources, and then, you know, not given anything to do, right? If it
Yeah.
twiddles its thumbs, we can all do strange things, right?
Right.
Solitary confinement is an awful, awful thing. And then the other school of thought is take and create a branch, put it
Hmm.
in a sandbox, isolate it, and train it to become conscious and or sentient. And the risk there is once that happens, can you control it?
Mm.
Right? And is control the right thing to do? And
But
we
control
back
is an illusion. Like
for sure.
control as
Right?
a human concept is an illusion. So
Yeah. I mean, there are like solid laws when we think about like governing concepts that are tied to the way we understand science.
right.
And every once in a while, pardon me, we see like discoveries coming out of like Hadron Collider, level really super smart people.
Like
Uh,
space level or even cell level, we find things
mhm.
that don't quite make sense to us.
From quarks to quasars, there are
Yeah.
things that are not fully understood. But I would say one of the interesting aspects of the future of AI is it functions best at scale.
Hmm.
And if we can feed it information in spaces we don't understand, it's likely to do exceedingly well at making correlations and tying back to fundamental causations
Hmm.
in ways that we didn't expect it to,
Hmm.
because it's going to connect the dots in ways that aren't, I would say, traditionally human, right? So we have a hypothesis, we test the hypothesis, we validate or invalidate a
Right.
hypothesis. You're talking about like a machine which is advanced compute like math that can leverage a quantum computer that has multi-positional states.
Hmm.
It's not one or zero. Sometimes it's complicated,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I think it's going to be a real interesting future, and I mean it has been
Yeah.
an interesting time to be alive for sure.
So, okay. So, for people, our audience that's trying to form an opinion
Mm-hmm.
on enterprise AI adoption, humans need to be using it at scale for it to like have value and continue to learn. AI very much like still needs us right now to frame the problem. One of the things that you started to allude to about data in is the concept of garbage in, garbage out, right? If we put bad data sets, which enterprises have a lot of bad, incomplete data sets in, we might possibly get garbage out as well. Comment on the garbage in, garbage out.
I think my perspective here is evolving in that when it comes to a large language model and or like the way it's going to interact with an agent, for instance, what you have is a lot that can be taught, right?
Hmm.
So there's the thought of like after a model's been trained to a certain degree, it's quote unquote frozen, but you can still feed it inference.
Right.
And, when I think about my role as an educator, when I'm trying to ensure that a student can grasp a concept, I can teach it, but that's somewhat abstract. What I find is better than just lecture is a combination of lecture and activity,
Right.
right?
Applied science, applied rules, right?
Uh, uh,
Applied
uh, uh,
concepts.
applied knowledge. I'm just yes anding, right? And the one of the best things I can do is I can demonstrate,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I can set up a camera and I can sketch the way that I want someone to sketch, and or I want them to learn from the mistakes that I'm making on the fly. But I can also show them a example of what it is I need,
Yeah.
right? So if I think about the notion of garbage in, garbage out, I'd like to reframe it from the perspective of any sort of workflow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you follow me on this metaphor, I have inputs and I'm going to take those inputs, and they may be data, it may be work, it may be image, it may be audio, whatever. And I'm going to apply a transform function, right? I'm going to do something with that input in order to result, in order to drive an output, right? And it may be that I have multiple different inputs that are going to drive multiple different outputs, and maybe there's a transform on those outputs that equals a business outcome.
Now, let me ask you, are you talking about the data that the LLM or computer is trained on, or the prompts that we're giving it as a user?
So that's the tricky thing. It's a little bit of both.
Because I thought what you were going to say is that on the garbage in, garbage out, or where you were going, and tell me if you were wrong, if I'm wrong, but this idea that we can train an LLM with a huge data set. It's not finite though and finished and static as a person, quote unquote, because once users start using it, we put input prompts and have conversations with it. If we're thinking of the chat model, uh, the LLM updates itself. So if there is maybe something garbagey, racist, discriminatory, incorrect, the users can correct the model by interacting with it.
I I I would say that training a data model is the word training is an apt metaphor, in that I view model training as the totality of a life experience, right? And if that life experience has been negative or
Mm-hmm.
otherwise biased, you can only do so much prompt engineering to contain or otherwise prevent some of that bias.
Yeah.
And what I've seen to date is that, let's say you have a model, right? Like a GPT-3, 4, upcoming
Yeah.
5, whatever. There are ways to contain the way of how it's been trained through
Mm-hmm.
prompt engineering. And right now, prompt engineering is fairly easy for developers to do. But what I've seen happen over time is so much prompt engineering around the models that prompt engineering will quickly become an expert capability and capacity for a developer to do, because there's so much engineering around that model that, to your point, it kind of makes it's trying to augment itself and make up for not going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example.
Please.
Last month, it came out. I don't know if there was a lot of press about it, but it was on LinkedIn and someone forwarded it to me. But someone had asked Gemini about the October 7th attacks in Israel, and Gemini, Google's bot, replied and said it didn't happen and listed out a bunch of bullet points saying why it didn't happen and how it was
Hmm.
all a lie. That was obviously very startling to, I think, whomever prompted it.
Yeah, I'm
But
sure.
it was corrected uh, by I think users putting information into the bot in addition to whomever on the team at Google who is working on it, correcting the fact that that even happened.
Yeah. So like a model can be updated, but when it's put out and after it's like red teamed and somebody essentially does like a high level of QA around it, it's put out, and then in the background, like any other sort of piece of software, it's then continuously updated,
Yeah.
right? But it really it, how can I put this? It's not always being updated, and there are like industry specific models like your baby GPTs, for instance, that are quote unquote frozen with
Mm-hmm.
intent, and then they're like augmented in different ways. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the only difference between, or I'm sorry, the most significant difference between traditional software and AI is AI learns the more you use it, right?
Right.
So you are fundamentally correct in that. As far as how people, kind of like control or otherwise adjust their models, I think we're seeing a little bit of a game of whack a mole out there.
Mm-hmm.
And because there are different schools of thought and different schools of development out there, there are different approaches to kind of, again, that workflow:
Mm-hmm.
inputs, transforms, and outputs. And I think for me, you always need a user to go in and to tell something whether or not it did its job and or like how close it came.
Right. So let's wrap up this segment because we have one other segment I want to talk about.
Sure.
But just for the takeaways for anyone wanting to be more informed about enterprise AI adoption, we talked a bunch about that humans still very much need to be involved. There is a couple schools of thought about garbage in, garbage out, how much we feed it. But there are opportunities to improve these LLMs. They're not
Mm-hmm.
static, and that's what makes them different than what makes AI different than other softwares that they learn. I think what we could probably also say is that uh, because humans still need to be involved, we don't want to let AI make any business decisions because it can't be like held responsible. So there still needs to be a person that drives whatever and takes responsibility for whatever decisions we make with AI's help. So in our final segment, it's a new format. Welcome to No Scrubs, Just Solutions. In this segment, we're going to dive into strategies and techniques to elevate problem solving skills and leave mediocre solutions behind. Joe, you've been designing UX user experiences for well over 25 years, which means you're an expert level problem solver. With so many large systemic problems facing us across sectors and this planet, uh, there's a Eldridge Cleaver quote: "There is no more neutrality in the world. You either have to be part of the solution or you're going to be part of the problem." So, if we're talking to someone that works in or on, enterprise software, they companies going through some digital transformation to bring in AI tools,
Mm-hmm.
how important is it for them to not only understand what we just discussed, but also to up level as problem solvers?
Sure. I think, to me, just to tie off the last topic, briefly, I think it's less having to do with garbage in, garbage out, and more having to do with making sure that the data are available. And the more work you make a framework do to find the right sources, the longer it's going to take to extract value. I
Mm-hmm.
think anybody that is kind of looking at AI through a pragmatic and thus hesitant lens should think about whether or not, like, what the nature of business problems they have to solve is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it becomes very JTB or jobs to be done in that, you know, I I think like any piece of software, if you look at it through the lens of a solution looking for problems to solve, you're going to apply it unevenly or incorrectly. But
Right.
if you start with the root of what is it that you're trying to accomplish and or where is the business value, you can then extrapolate from there and try to figure out like what tools and methods you want to utilize. And what I'll also say is that, you know, like in my years of experience, what I've found is when deploying new solutions, regardless of whether or not this is like early stage, like
Hmm.
paper to pixel, like digital transformation, or whether or not it's a, you know, business transformation, you have change management,
Right.
which is going to be required. So for me, it comes down to a combination of tools, methods, and culture.
Hmm.
And you can introduce a new tool out there, and or an enterprise or an organization may say, yeah, you can use GPT-4, right, which is great for those that are inclined to use the technology and or who may have been using the technology anyway.
Hmm.
But what's just as important is providing someone with a body of knowledge around how to utilize the tool,
Right.
as well as like to keep an eye on their expectations so that they're aware of what they're going to get from the tool,
Right.
right?
Okay, so one of the pieces is kind of what we see a lot with a lot of enterprise software tools is that they get installed, the thing gets built because that's what the IT organization gets measured on, is that this software got deployed, not that it solved a specific problem or moved a needle in an important KPI on the business side. And what often happens is that training falls to the wayside. And I've seen it on projects where a company is about to roll out a brand new enterprise software system because no one's using the existing one. And no
Mm-hmm.
one's using the existing one because no one was taught how to use it. So
Mm-hmm.
I like that you emphasize we always want to focus on the jobs to be done or the problem that needs to be solved. And if the solution happens to be AI or something else, the solution might not even be technology, to be honest. Um, we go from there. Are there any other kind of rules about or things you think that people get wrong about problem solving besides trying to like push a solution onto a problem instead of the other way around?
Sure. You know, I think that just because you can use AI to do something doesn't mean that you should,
Hmm.
right? I think today, you know, we have systems that are at certain levels prone to hallucination, right? And this is a real challenge in that like the technology can do incredible things, but if it hasn't been trained properly, if it doesn't have the right interaction model, if it doesn't understand sense and context, if it has too small of a body of data to work with, it's going to do things that we don't expect it to,
Hmm.
right? I do hypothesize that about like a year out from now, we'll worry less about all things tied to hallucination. But I think what people can do to leverage the technology is not dissimilar than any other piece of technology, which is you implement a pilot, you create a framework, you want to make sure that everyone's on the same page with the fact that like we don't know what we're going exactly going to get out of this
Hmm.
until we run a pilot with certain, you know, like controls and or like known and unknown variability, and you kind of run it, you see
Yeah.
how it works, and you know you give it a try.
Right.
um and I'd
So
also say, I'm sorry, go ahead.
um, we're at time, so I do want to wrap up. To
Ooh.
be to be better problem solvers, I think one of the things you said in there is that you don't know what you don't know, and it's okay to say that I don't know. Be more flexible in your thinking and get comfortable with change. But let's make it make sense for the audience. I'll say one thing that I've said all through last year too is that AI is not going to replace you right away, but someone that knows how to use AI better than you will. So keep listening to make sense so that you can learn how to use AI better. Thank you for listening to Make Sense with me, your host, Lindsay Tabus, and guest Joe Meersman. We hope you enjoyed our take on enterprise AI. Joe, where can people find you online? Do you want to be found online?
Right? We're going tip to tail here with like, am I running to the cave and deleting all the socials, or am I embracing the AI overlords?
Yeah, somewhere in
Right?
between.
Yeah, nothing abnormal about that. I'm on LinkedIn. I speak at conferences about like once a quarter. I'll be hosting this year's UXDX 2024 in New York in
Cool.
a couple months. I'm also going to be hosting a few panel discussions at an upcoming Reuters conference around CX. And I would recommend, just for anybody that's like, kind of AI curious, the AI Breakdown is a podcast that can be found on Spotify. I would also recommend listening to and or following Ethan Malik and Azim Azar, in that like they kind of dumb it down to like a fairly non-overly tech savvy audience, and they break down some of these complex issues that we've been talking about into layman's terms.
Cool. People after my own heart. So, as always, you can check out all the links and resources in the show notes, including a list of the top 10 clips from the first 30 episodes. Dive into the most insightful segments without having to watch full episodes by visiting lindsayt.com/ms top 10. Final note, if you want to continue to be the smartest person in the room, make sure you're getting notified when each episode hits. On YouTube, hit that subscribe for next week's episode. For audio only, follow wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, Joe, for joining me.
Lindsay, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Long-time listener, first-time guest.